Brilliant. Yeah, just echo that. Just thank you for the opportunity to present today. I think it's great that Perform Better kind of giving practitioners within the school sector a platform to share their work, and it's a really exciting and developing area. Um, this presentation today is hopefully useful in a couple of ways in terms of it's going to share some of the reflection of where we are as a school program, and also dive into what I think is one of the most effective ways to kind of integrate athletic development across the school program. Um, Mainly because I think it can be key in just delivering a consistent message across all sessions, whether that's PE, sport, or all the athletic development as well. And I think the other side to that is getting the content right, and also the development within the PE stuff as well. A little bit of context around my school scenario. So we're an all girls independent day school. We have a high academic focus. I think that's what the school would pride itself on and sell itself on. But we've also got a strong sports program. We come quite high in the top 100 of the independent schools. But if you were to ask anybody over at the main bit of the school, they'd say that we're an academic place. And I think that kind of gives us quite a broad range of girls, especially within a PE context. You've got girls that are really uninterested all the way up to playing some really high level sport. The year groups we've got a couple of year 5 and year 6 classes, but that's quite a small cohort. But then from year 7 onwards, it's like a full secondary school. In terms of the PE exposures that they have 2 lessons a week, and the curriculum's just a usual PE curriculum, mainly sport based. But we've got 1 6-week fundamental movement skill block that's kind of taken over the health related fitness block, and it's become a fundamental movement skill block. We don't have, I'm aware people are from different schools and they're all very different. We don't, because we're a day school, and with our timetable, we don't have any games afternoons. So all the kind of sessions that aren't PE sessions, all the sports sessions are either lunchtime or after school sessions. A bit about my role. This is my 2nd year in this school. So we've been progressing from there. There wasn't any athletic development before that. But I've been working within youth athletic development for the past 6 years. Within the school setting over the past 2 years, we've had a unified warm-up in place. So we're sort of showing this presentation, we had a bit of a reflection of where we're up to, which hopefully relates to a few people, as it's quite an early thing within schools, and we can kind of show where we are in our development as we go. So as a PE department, we recently went through this. Just a couple of weeks ago, we were as conscious of keeping on top of our kind of momentum of what we were doing and how we were building athletic development and that movement skill focus within PE. So we just wanted to have a bit of a check. Our thought process joined up, and I think this is probably one of the hardest things to kind of merge in athletic development within the PE curriculum, because it's just the differences in terms of education and experiences between S&C coaches, athletic development coaches, and PE staff, PE teachers. Not that one is better than the other necessarily. I've learned tons from the teachers I've worked with over the time, and their education has covered loads of stuff that mine didn't at university. But I think if you're going down this strength and conditioning and athletic development route, then chances are your S&C coaches is probably more up to date on your Lloyd and Oliver and the general practices of training and integrating these things. So we have to learn off each other. The second question was, are we maximizing our time? I think it's something the warm-up can potentially get overlooked. It's a bit of a double-edged sword in that it can be a program driver, but it could also go stale probably just to the sheer number of warm-ups that both the kids do and the staff have to deliver. It's probably quite high, and it's an easy thing to just either say to the kids, go warm up yourselves, gives you a bit of time to get ready for the lesson if you rushed. But I'm hopefully going to convince you today that we need to take ownership over it a little bit more. So this is a little bit of continued reflection. I think we're 2 years into this. We've had a general framework in place, and the results off that were that we're in a much better place than before. There was a lot more continuity in what was getting delivered. The movements that were being incorporated into the warm-ups were better, whether you're just looking at simple squat, lunge mechanics, single leg RDLs, and the quality of that was better as well. and also just kind of the language, the terms. They probably never knew what a single leg RDL was even before that. So that understanding side of things was getting better as well. But I think we were a little bit stuck in our framework and had to probably progress it or vary it. And I think that's what some of the PE teachers were struggling with. So if you have a look about the why, we all know the base physiology, so we won't go into that. But the things I want to focus on are kind of really key terms within, for me, for athletic development and what should be thought about within a PE curriculum. And they're physical literacy, physical capacity, motor competence and perceived competence, motivation that ties in with that, and then the injury reduction point as well. So we start with physical literacy. I think this has got to be the bedrock of what we do. And if you're to be really reductionist and deconstruct the components of activity, sport, health, then being physically literate has to be the core aim. I think a bit like learning the alphabet is the underpinning of language or English as a subject. From a complexity standpoint, sport is really chaotic and complex. And I equate it to like me joining an orchestra, and I'm not musical. So if you stuck me in an orchestra in a symphony and asked me to just play the triangle, I'd still be lost, even though you're going, well, you're just playing the triangle. And I think that's the same disconnect some of our, probably the bottom end kids have in whatever sport within a PE lesson that they're being asked to engage in. So how can we give them those tools and get them to more around this point in the graph that are higher end? If we can get them proficient or literate, then they're more able to take part. And then that removes that big barrier for participation, which I think is something that I'm massive on trying to get everybody, rather than just focus on the top end, bringing that bottom end up. So if they can be confident, then they're competent and they can engage more and the quantity of activity can go up. So big point number one, can we build physically literate kids through teaching fundamental movement skills in an engaging way and get activity levels up? Another component to that is strength. I think strength as a term gets too tied in with kind of gym strength, lifting weights. And from my perspective, working in a girls' school, probably they're thinking big blokes. But I think we have to try and find a way to normalize the term, because the reality is lots of our kids are physically weak. And if we have a look at this kind of dream model from Avery Feigenbaum, then there's a range of that kind of dynapenic, restricted, emerging, adapted, and mighty levels. And I think a thing to note is that some kids can be athletically gifted. They could look like they're tearing it up, but we can't make the assumption that they're either strong or are proficient in their fundamental movement skills as well. They could be really competent at their sporting skills, but it's potentially a little bit of a house built on sand if we make that assumption. One of the main concerns is this kind of bottom end of the graph. If we look at that dynapenic and restricted area, that dynapenic term is normally used with kind of old age groups, but they flipped it round to have a look at its components. So this is the definition, and a couple of things that resonate is that kind of inability to voluntarily activate the muscle and to produce force. And that means there's a functional limitation to what they do. And I think if we can probably think of times when definitely things like, say, like a walking lunge, a kid looks like they're all over the place. They're not managing to piece one into the next one at all. And we normally assume it's probably a motor issue or a coordination issue, but the chances are it's probably a strength issue as well. And so I think we need to keep that in the back of our minds as well. The third part to that puzzle is what we call physical capacity. So do they have the physical capacity to engage with the lesson or the whole of the lesson? And that kind of completes what Feigenbaum terms this pediatric inactivity triad. And the focus within this model is whether they achieve 60 minutes of that moderate to vigorous physical activity a day, but also do they have the capability to do that? And that will probably have an indication of whether they have the capacity to engage in the lesson to the level that we would like and for the whole lesson. And that's how it kind of fits together. So what is the underlying limitation? Is it that physical literacy, that proficiency, that movement proficiency? Is it a lack of strength to physically deal with the movements and the forces involved within the lesson, within the sport? Or is it a capacity issue? It's really unlikely that a kid, even at the top end, will have all three ticked off, and there'll be potentially some kids that have none. So when you next look at a kid moving, going through their warm up, have a little think about from these kind of three viewpoints. The physical literacy, have they got the range of movement skills? Are they strong enough to deal with the demands of what you're asking them to do? And do they have the capacity that maybe they could do it at the start and then they're struggling? That might be a capacity thing. But it isn't purely about the physical. So if you have a little look at a couple of papers just to define some key terms, one of the things is that motor competence, and that's the ability to execute a diverse range of motor skill tasks in a skillful manner. And the research is showing that there's a positive relationship between a kid's motor competence and their physical activity levels. The other term to think about is it's their self-perceived competence as well. And it's that self-perceived competence can contribute to their motivation for physical activity and the extent which they value being active. So overall, the aim is to build that literacy, that physical literacy and confidence, because that will improve the likelihood that they're going to continue to be physically active as they get older, which for school-based programs and for PE programs, for me, that's got to be our top aim, is that they're going to be physically active with us and when they leave as well, and that we've given them the tools to do that. So motor competence, physical activity levels, their self-perceived competence, which ties into their motivation. Off the back of linking that into competence with motivation and physical activity, we have to make a stop at self-determination theory, which I'm sure a lot of you have come across already. But I think if we look around those terms around motivation, of autonomy, competence, relatedness, I think we can see how they interact. And I think for me, competence is the key one. Because if they have the competence, then that gives them, or helps them get the autonomy, because it gives them the choice to express themselves how they want. And if they can express themselves, then they're able to engage, and then they will feel like they belong in that lesson. You can think about it, if they're not competent, they can't express themselves, they can't take part, then they're not going to feel like they're going to feel like they don't belong in that lesson. So can we give them the competence? Which ties into my kind of favorite quote that I've come across, is that an athlete's intrinsic motivation is dependent onto the extent which athletes perceive themselves to be competent. So how do they view themselves? And we can all think of situations where we've not felt that competent or confident to do something that we've come across, but we've kind of, as adults, we can probably convince ourselves, but for kids, they probably can't, they're probably just going to disengage. And if we have a look at that across the range of self-determination theory, from a motivation on the left, the kind of those intrinsic motivation subcategories, all the way to intrinsic motivation, where would you put your kids within your PE lessons? Are they amotivated? Do they lack? Do they not get the value? They don't get why they're doing it, or is it just that it's more internal, that they just don't perceive themselves to be very competent? All the way up to starting to understand some personal importance from it. Do they start to value it? All the way to just really enjoying it, and inherently we can see that they enjoy it. And that's ultimately the biggest question. How do we get them more to this kind of right hand side? And I think that's where we come back to that competence and building the physical literacy, the capacity and the strength that should hopefully give them the motivation or the ability to be motivated and perceive themselves to be competent. Last but not least, this is a bit of a crazy slide, but it's an infographic that it's a couple of sheets that I've made. But the things I'll highlight are from a female working with a girls' school. There's a big injury risk, and the research around kind of ACL injuries. When I turned up at the school a couple of years ago, there was 3 girls that had ACL injuries in the back end of the year before I started. So as soon as I came into the environment, we already had 3 ACLs. And touch wood, since we started, we've not had one since. But the research generally says that they're 4 to 6 times more likely to suffer an ACL injury. a high proportion of which are non-contact injuries. But that makes sense when we're thinking about the things we've talked about, that those, if they don't have the physical literacy, if they don't have the strength, don't have the capacity, then those high force, high velocity actions, like jumping, cutting, or decelerating, are the areas and points where they're going to get hurt. But the flip of that, in terms of what we can do, the highest kind of one I could find was that there was an 88% reduction in ACL injuries off the back of a neuromuscular proprioceptive training program. This meta-analysis of meta-analyses, this a review of all the reviews, found a general figure of 67% reduction for non-contact ACL injuries in females, which is huge for training programs. And generally, for injury prevention programs within use, there's a 40% reduction in injuries overall. So some really good research there to kind of show that these have massive impact. Because if kids aren't getting injured within the sports and within, probably not as likely within PE lessons, but within the sports side of things, then they're more able to keep engaged with what we want them to do. And this kind of final one, probably most people have seen, it's the schoolboy rugby injury intervention program, and that found a 70% injury reduction for their warm-up based program. But there's also an interesting thing, and there was the dose response relationship, that 3 times a week was required for it to be effective, which is something to keep in mind. So we understand that these injury prevention programs essentially can be warm-ups. Our warm-ups are our injury prevention programs, but we just don't. We can either focus them as that, but within a PE setting, it's probably just a side bonus of what we're trying to do. And there's loads, whether you want to look at the FIFA 11 Plus, there's tons of research around that. But also this kind of dose response relationship to think about. So that's kind of the why. We've looked at the physical literacy, physical capacity, motor competence, perceived competence, that motivation. Are they a bit of a zombie in it, or are they happy with what they're doing, and their injury reduction? Let's have a look at the how and the what. I think the main thing we need to do is view the warm-up as an opportunity, rather than, it's guaranteed coaching time, rather than something that we have to do. And I get it's easy for it to be brushed under the carpet, but it sets up your lesson. For my context, the exposures in the right, with the 2 PE lessons they have a week, if they engage with sports, then the sports training, they might have 2 training sessions with that. If they do 2 sports, then that'll be 4 times a week. If they're into their athletic development, there'll be another one in there. And if they play the matches as well, that could be 1 or 2 matches on top of that as well. I should have mentioned our main sports are netball and lacrosse. So in terms of kind of counting those exposures up, our bottom end that do PE only, that's the only thing they're going to get in the week, would have 2 exposures. That mid-range, they do their PE and they might be engaged in the sport as well, be around 5 exposures a week. And the top ones, really keen ones, doing PE, might be doing 2 sports and athletic development, might be getting 8 to 9 exposures a week. So over a half term, that bottom end is around 12 and the top end could be around 50. And over a school year, roughing it, averaging it out at 6 half terms at 6 weeks, we're not going to get all of them, obviously, but as an easy figure, the bottom end would be 72 and the top end might be around 300. So you can see how the girls could get motivated with how repetitive it could get, and coaches as well. If the top end are doing 300, then that means we're probably doing at least 2, 3, 4 times that. So it's easy for it to go, but I think we've got to keep on it. In terms of time, the bottom end, that means they're getting 30 minutes. And if we think about that kind of dose response, the question that we're trying to answer is that enough of a dose to make a change? And I think as the language and the understanding around integrating more fundamental movement skills and athletic development within PE as a general thing, as a general program, combined with the warm-up focus, probably means that it is. But we've probably got to maximize it and make the most of it. But it also means that top end, those kids, we've got to be trying to engage them as well. Because if we have a look at the total over a year, the bottom end's 18 hours, the top end's getting close to 80 hours potentially of warm-up. But that's a huge amount of time So what can we do with that time? How can we maximize the bottom end, but that also pushes the top end as well? So how? Is there, my question is there a unified structure or framework within your warm-ups? And does it go across the PE curriculum, the sports program, and the athletic development program? That's one of the main things we found by having that across everything, and there's a unified approach, that it just makes the message consistent across the program. I think there's so many ways to skin a cat, and sometimes you might just have to pull something random out of the bag for a particular session that they're not very motivated to come in, or you're short on time. But if generally you keep hitting the same messages, then that supports where you're trying to go. What does that look like? And does it build and incorporate the components around physical literacy, strength, capacity that we've talked about? I think, like most S&Cs, RAMP is probably the framework where things originated, and this is the basis of our version. That kind of raise, activate, mobilize, and potentiate kind of is the basis of a really good warm up if you're looking to start somewhere and don't already have a framework in place. These are the couple of places where I'd go to. And this is the progression, which I have to shout out James Davis and Ben Pullen at Marlborough College, where this was developed. And the progression is that second M, and that's the movement integration. And this has been our framework for the past couple of years. I mentioned at the start, it's done a great job. It's been great for suggesting a flow and how to progress things through a warm-up. But it's been very, so it's generically athletic development based. We are working on things like looking at lunges, tying in some little bit of locomotor stuff, whether it's inchworms, world's greatest stretch, looking at some more kind of athletic based things like A-skips, marches, and then progressing onto our potentiation with hops, pogos, broad jumps. But it's been we found that this has been like on the wall on the sides, and it's been easy for PE teachers to kind of go look at the framework, and they've got stuck within just these exercises that are in front of them, rather than just forgetting about the bottom half of that and just thinking, right, what do I do for raise? What do I do for activate? Can I bring them together? So that's where we got to kind of 2 years on. It's done its job. It's worked really well. But how do we get it and take it on? I think the first thing we need to think about tying this all in is thinking about the movements. So whether that's a simplified fundamental movement skills circle, something like this that looks at, got some basic fundamental movement skills on the left, like lunge, hip hinge, squat, push, pull, brace, rotate, or some of the basic locomotor skills, jump, land, rebound, accelerate, decelerate, change direction? Or is it something a little bit more in depth, like the athletic motor skill competencies that kind of tie in a bit of kind of more body sections, lower body, upper body, bilateral, unilateral, the movement planes around vertical, horizontal, or is it the muscle actions, movement actions as well, the concentric, isometric, eccentric? So I think for PE teachers that potentially are starting out with this and don't fully understand it, would steer more to the left. As they get more competent in understanding what they're trying to do, can they start to integrate more variety in what they're trying to do? Can they think about, right, we've done a load of go, it's been a load of concentric stuff. We need to get some landing work in to look at that eccentric side? Or can we have a variety of done everything facing forward? Can we add in some rotation, some lateral based work, depending on where we're trying to get to? I think the main point I want to make today is, if we're thinking about competence and supporting these kids to trying to give them the tools to engage in the sport, we have to think about what's in their toolbox. So do they have the underpinning base movement patterns for the lesson? The example I'll give is, and this fits in that kind of movement integration area. The example I'll give is a badminton example. Probably how many times have we seen that the shuttlecock's come over the net and it's just landed in front of the kid and they've not even moved? And we've probably just thought it might be a motivation thing that they're just not fast, they're not bothered. But we probably thought, why didn't they go for that? The other question I'd like to ask yourselves is, do they have the underpinning movements to even engage with to make that shot? So were they they probably didn't even anticipate where the shuttlecock was going in the first place, but did they have the underpinning movement? So were they an athletic base? Could they take those couple of acceleration steps? Could they drop into that lunge position to then even engage with the sporting skill? So do they have those underpinning movements to apply the sporting skill, or be in a position that they can apply that sporting skill? I think if we apply that to lots of other sports, so we're thinking about, these are just some examples. So you could think about athletic based position, defending positions, single leg landing, deceleration within netball, the squat position, athletic base, again, that's really relevant. The deceleration, change of direction, acceleration, a hip hinge. How do these basic fundamental movements apply? And I think if we can make those connections early and highlight them, then that will help the kids understand about what we're trying to do as well on that basic level, while also giving them that chance to become competent to then execute those sporting skills. And I think that goes back to me being placed in a symphony and orchestra. I didn't know what was coming. I didn't know what to do. I didn't have the tools to execute what was happening around me. So I think about that toolbox. So if you're to pick, these are all the sports that we cover within a curriculum. And if you were to pick, nail down some kind of top 3 things that are really important for each sport, what would you come up with? And you could probably change some of these. Some of you might have some different ideas around these. It's completely flexible. But as a base thing, if you're thinking about a lesson to a PE teacher, right, we've said about badminton, it might be a forward lunge, crossover step, side lunge, crossover lunge type movements. Netball might be jumping and landing. There's probably things that come up in quite a lot of them. So athletic base probably applies to nearly all of them. So could we look at the curriculum as a whole, all the sports that are going to get, all the movement skills that are going to get ticked off, and the ones where it could get ticked off a lot. Could we be a bit more experimental and add something in, like during cricket, something like a dive and roll? It could be anything, but we could just add some other little skills in just to get that bit more variety. The other thing to think about is the loading. So I think we can get bogged down, especially S&Cs, in terms of kind of reps, distances, contacts, sets, volume. But I think the main things we need to be concerned about are how the movements performed, kind of the quality of them, and thinking about the tempo of those actions. How would you simplify it down? How would you rate those movements in terms of load from low to high? And how can you progress them session to session? So the answer might be to focus on kind of a total exposure for the warm up and progress from there. So kind of think about what you want your warm up to be, do it the first couple of weeks, and then make some notes about it. So it might be, right, we roughly covered about 50 squats or squat landings, link that to athletic base, covered around 20 single leg jumps, probably about 5 minutes of running or sprinting. Or even better, if you've got a girl or a student that's off sport, get them to track a couple of people and make some notes or tally some things up. Because then you've got your base level. It might take a little bit of trial and error, but then that's where you can progress it. You could look at what the movements we're hitting, what's the ratio of loads, and then what's the exposures, and that gives you your base to think about progressing on from there. So I don't think we have to be overly prescriptive going into it, but if we kind of keep an eye on it and track it and make sure that we are progressing through things. And if we think about that, kind of go back to that dream model, think about strength, you're trying to hit that range of loads within this as well. It also gives where that coaching comes in. It's left a bit more open than trying to get bogged down in it. So what does that look like? So this is an example for a year 7 netball lesson. So if we said that our key things within netball are jumping and landing, lateral movement, and single leg stability, then how can we incorporate those things within the warm-up? So we're still working within the ramp framework, but we're going to start with a game. We're going to try and engage people and get them going as soon as possible up that physical activity level straight away, so we're maximizing that 10-15 minutes that we've got. So this is an example that works really well because it also incorporating a little bit of netball skill in there as well. So it could be, the setup is half a sports hall. We have a slight variation on that. We have 4 bibs to catches, and then we have 4 releases as well. And each of those releases has a netball. So then when the kids get stuck, that's where we incorporate a fundamental movement skill. We'll get stuck into a position, and to be released, the release is running around the netball. They have to do a little 1-2 pass. It has to be a clean catch. You can't go on the floor. There's that skill element, and then they're free to run around again. And those releases can't be caught. But that's where we can stick those fundamental movement skills into the lesson, and we'll start easy, just go athletic based position, and it could be anything. It could be a squat position. It could be a lunge hold, bottom lunge hold. It could be a physical capacity thing we want to work on, like some low pogos, just bouncing on the spot. We've done different ones where they go into like a front support, like a top of a press up position, and they have to roll the ball underneath them to be able to get free. That means they can't have dropped their hips, and they have to keep in a good position, otherwise they can't be released. But it could be anything. But we're just trying to be clever in how we integrate the fundamental movement skills straight away into the lesson, but it's an engaging way. The mobilizations will be pretty standard, but if we can try and keep them thinking about the areas that they're most likely to need. So in a school environment, they're sat down a lot, so kind of hamstring, hips, back, the upper back, they spend a lot of time at their desks. So how can we open those things up? So that really like things like going into inchworms, and when they're into that top of a front support position, going to a shoulder tap, things like world's greatest stretch, duck walks, and incorporating some single leg stability stuff like a single leg RDL. And you could progress that onto going into a little hop onto the next foot, just to start to build to where we want to go to next. And then continue that on in the movement integration. So it could be something simple for that, trying to think about the range of loads that make it accessible. So we start with a forward lunge, and then we just progress it on to go right forward lunge, and when you're coming up, you go into a high knee position, a little bit like an A position. So we're working on some running mechanics, and then we make that. Now you've gone from a forward lunge, high knee, and then you're going to drop into that lunge, and you're going to catch at the bottom. So we're thinking a bit about that single leg landing with a little bit of support, eccentric loading as well. Then we look at some single leg hop and holds, start really simple, small, and they can progress it. But this is where the kids can have that bit of autonomy about how far they jump, but they've just got to be able to stick it. That's the main criteria. And we can then progress the directions. They can go left, right, to the inside of the foot, to the outside of the foot, backwards, whatever it is. Just get a range of things in there. And then we can start to think a little bit about something that may be a little bit more applied. So APB, athletic base position, they could say if they're all in a line and they've turned 90 degrees to the left, they're going to load up off their left leg and launch themselves to the right and rotate 90 degrees in the air, and then they have to land on that single leg. So it's like they've come off a cut within the netball lesson, and they're in the air and they're going to catch the ball. There's that slight bit of rotation. We're just starting to integrate that a little bit, and can they control it? And that potentiation, we just progress that on. I really like really simple ones to do are just kind of athletic based fast feet position, but then just layer in some different things. There's loads of options. It could be they're reacting to a whistle. You could have 2 or 3 cones behind your back and they've got to react on the red one. It could be a certain word that's the cue that you're going to use, or it could be an action as well. So a really simple example is that we're athletic based position facing forwards, doing fast feet, and then on the cue, they sprint forwards 10 meters and that's it. But then you can start to layer in things again. We could change the position. They could be side on, they could be backwards. Do they have the capability that it starts to encourage a kind of a drop step? Can they open up, turn their hips, rotate and accelerate? They could be lying down, they could be on the back, start to integrate. So that means they have to kind of roll, get up off the floor, and then start to layer things in from there. Or it could be that when they hit the line, they've got to do another action. So overall, we're trying to think about, we're still using that framework, but we've just not got bogged down in too much of it. But we just try to be clever in terms of what we're doing. Is it engaging? Are we thinking about that developing physical literacy, a bit of capacity and the strength with that range, and then just having that kind of range of things that we want to hit. So that little bit of reflection of from my scenario within SHSK, the progression that we're going to go on to is that we're going to say that warm-ups have to be led by the teacher, for year 7, 8, and 9, on the emphasis that their development is the most important thing. I think we want to give them the ownership and we want to trust them, but we're going to make the decision that we're going to lead it and we're going to develop them to give them that base, so we know that they're getting that base. And then once they get a little bit older, towards year 10, that emphasis shifts to that ownership. And hopefully then they have that understanding of their own body, what they need to warm up, and what's relevant for the session in front of them. And the other thing we're going to try is start to monitor and identify girls, and not to report on them, just something internally. So we can start to think about where are our gaps. So is it within a year group? Is it within a particular class? And then individuals? What is that main area that we need to focus on? Is it the range of movement skills? Is it that physical literacy? Is it just their strength levels? We need to spend a little bit more time on within the warm-ups on maybe a squat or a lunge, just stick some things in. Done it before where we just get all the PE, the classic sports hall benches. You can do tons off them, integrate some split squats, some plyometrics on and off the bench, just to get a little bit more of a strength basis in there. Or is it that capacity? Is it their engagement and motivation towards what we're doing? Are we getting the content right for each class and age group? So overall, my main takeaways would be to value the warm-up, that it's the opening act for your lesson, so it can make it or break it. I think we need to really value it. And then keep in mind just overall levels of activity. If we can keep the levels of activity high, then that's going to have those trickle-on effects to everything else that we're doing. Make sure we've got those fundamental movement skills development in there. And then definitely those applied movement skills for the lesson to follow. What are you doing next? What are you going to go into? Have you ticked those boxes? Have you covered the relevant skills for them to do that? And then, because when you're in the lesson, you can then apply it in, and it just brings it all together. And are there a range of loads across that warm-up? Thinking about that dream model, are we hitting those low exposures all the way up to the high? And I think that kind of ties in with that student differentiation, or that regression progression. If a lunge is too easy for a really able girl, how can you make it harder? What have you got in your back pocket? If you had a pause in between their lunges, could they have to do it with their eyes shut? Can they do it just on the ball of foot without the heel on the ground? Add in a little bit of instability in there. But you have to find a framework that works for you. If that doesn't fit for you, just make one up. But just think about, what are your key things? What do you want in that warm up? What do you want the content? And can you make a little progression out of that? But make sure everybody's on the same page. So thank you. And yeah, if we've got any questions, then open that up.
Josh, that was excellent. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, I can hear you, man.
Perfect. Josh, that was really, really good, really insightful. I think the warm-up's probably the most, maybe underrated aspect. And I've certainly had some, I think it's called the Sky Sports warm-up, isn't it? Where you run up and down some cones and that sort of stuff. I'll give those my time. But no, thanks again. That was absolutely excellent. We've got a load of questions. What I'll probably do is ask a few of them. A few of them are sort of very similar anyway. And then any others, if you're happy, I'll probably send them on and potentially just get an answer from you.
Yeah, just email them over, yeah.
Perfect. Okay, we'll start with this one. So with your FMS block replacing the old school HRF block, do you guys timetable this block to be in September? So that's the first Michaelmas half term for the whole school, or is it varied at different points per year?
Yeah, we try and get it in before, we can't get it all in that first half term, but definitely before Christmas. I think it's tied between trying to get the exposure to our main sports of netball and lacrosse, but then also the fundamental movement skills is in there. So yeah, we definitely try and front load the year. I think looking at what we're going to have to do in September, the athletic development side of things is going to become even more important, because the sports side of things probably can't operate as well as we want. So yeah, we definitely do try and get it in.
Absolutely. And being an academic school with students who may not necessarily see sport as a career or a hobby, what does the student buy-in be like, and what practices have you put in place to sort of improve this?
It's really ranged, because it is such a, there's some girls in there that I mean, we're based in Oxford. We've got girls where their parents might be professors at Oxford, and they just don't understand sport. They're not bothered at all. Don't see the relevance. And I think that's where it's just got to be enjoyable, and they can't think about it too much. If you engage them in something that's not too complex, like Stuck in the Mud's fine, like everybody can get on with that, and have fun with it. So I think just having those things that in your back pocket that you know are going to be fun and are simple, that it's not, there's no barriers in front of that. And because the other thing is we've also got girls that are in some kind of performance pathways for the same netball. They're in the same lesson. They're just looking at those girls kind of going, well, they're amazing. I don't want to get shown up by them. So trying to take away kind of one-on-one situations where they might get shown up, say, try and take those scenarios out of the equation so that nobody's ego can get damaged, essentially.
Yeah, absolutely. In terms of upskilling, how have you sort of managed the upskilling of other PE teachers within the department and to sort of deliver the process? Do you manage the 6-week block, or have you upskilled other people to be able to manage it as well?
Yeah, the fundamental movement skill block, I'll take that, but I will have a teacher with me so they're getting to see what we're doing. And then we have like a department meeting every week that I get a little 2, 3, 4, 5 minutes maybe in, that we can kind of use that little bit of time. And then I think that is the hardest thing though, because once we're into term time, everybody's got their own things. The teachers have reports and lots of things going on. So it's working with the director of sport to get some allotted time of going, right, there's not a lot on the agenda this week. Let's go have a look at the warm-up, or let's have a look at what we're going to do in fundamental movement skills or how we can get it better. So yes, I think it's been proactive in that regard.
Absolutely. And how you talk about sort of keeping it fresh there and really identified really well sort of how many warm-ups you do. How often will you repeat your warm-ups, and how do you sort of keep it fresh? So you showed us a netball example then. Would you use that once every few weeks, or how would that work?
I think it's a toss up between that. The other thing to think about is that you want a progression, you want to build on what you're trying to do. So you don't want it completely random, I think, is the other side of it as well. You don't want it to just jump from one thing to the next. So having it in for 2-3 weeks, and then, so you only got to change your warm up once every half term or so, that you're progressing it, but that you do have that progression in there to give them that time to get competent. Yeah, I think that is the other thing to note, that it could just get really random.
Yeah, absolutely. Last sort of couple, I think we've got until 22. I might have got my timings wrong. Next one is sort of, what would you say about the duration of a warm-up? How do you then sort of detract them from the main session objectives? Is there a sort of specific duration, or is it just you play it by ear, so to speak?
Yeah, I suppose our lesson is generally a double period, which for us is it's probably under an hour once they've got changed. So I think this is the kind of, we're getting there now, a couple of years in, that the teachers are kind of going, right, we're going to have a bit of faith in this. We're going to trust that it's okay to spend 10-15 minutes on a warm-up, because actually it's going to give the girls the skills to engage with the lesson rather than trying to brush under the carpet or rush it. So yeah, we generally try and spend 15 minutes. And sometimes it's flexible. Sometimes it might be going really well, and we're linking it in. The teacher set it up well, so it's going to tie in what we're going to do within the PE lesson. We might carry on. Yeah, I think it's open. We're generally aiming for that 15 minutes.
Perfect. I've been made aware that Game Changer meant to start at 11:30. I've got my timings wrong, but Josh, that was absolutely excellent. Really, really appreciate that. It's my fault for overrunning, but mate, that was really good. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much.
Appreciated. There are sort of 2 or 3 questions which I'll send over to you if you're happy just to answer.
Yeah, email. Yeah, drop me a message. Yeah.
Brilliant, Josh. Thank you very much. So guys, on to the final presentation. So Alex, Barry, and Simon Foskett. I hope I've got that right. Alex, Simon, are you there?
Hi Russ, you all right?
Hi Alex, how are you? Simon, how are you?
How you doing?
Good. Guys, thank you so much for your time. Really, really appreciate it. Apologies, I got my timings wrong, so we're 8 minutes late, so I apologise for that.
No worries.
Listen, I won't take up too much of your time. Guys, just to remind everyone, if you want to ask a question, you move your mouse on your screen, there is the chat icon, which looks like a little bubble. You write it on the right-hand side. I will ask the guys at the end of their presentation. But yeah, over to you guys. Thank you again.